It's a Tuesday morning, January 15th, 1974. In a quiet neighborhood in Wichita, Kansas, the Otero family is moving through their morning like any other. Joseph is 38. His wife, Julie, is 34. Their 9-year-old son, Joey, is getting ready. Their 11-year-old daughter, Josephine, is home. The older kids have already left for school. It's an ordinary Tuesday. But by the time those older children come home that afternoon, everyone they love will be gone, and a man will have walked back out the front door and disappeared, leaving investigators nothing but silence. That silence will last 31 years. What happens when a serial killer's greatest weakness isn't forensic evidence? It's his own ego. This is the story of Dennis Rader, the man who gave himself the name BTK, who murdered 10 people across 17 years, went quiet for 13 more, and then, when he could no longer stand being forgotten, made one mistake that ended everything. This case isn't just about how he killed. It's about why he came back. Dennis Lynn Rader grew up in Wichita, Kansas, the American heartland. By the mid-1970s, he was a married man with 2 children, a church attendee, a Boy Scout leader. He worked in home security installation, which investigators would later describe as chillingly relevant. On the surface, Rader was the kind of neighbor nobody suspects. The man who waves from the driveway, shows up to the church potluck, knows everyone's name. But beneath that surface, Rader had been nurturing violent fantasies since childhood. Fantasies that, by January 1974, he could no longer contain. He didn't just become a killer, he became a brand. He invented his own name, BTK, bind, torture, kill, and then he sent that name along with detailed descriptions of his crimes to newspapers and police departments. From the very first murder, Dennis Rader wasn't simply killing. He was performing. He needed an audience. He needed investigators to know he existed, to fear him, to chase him. He needed more than anything to be recognized as exceptional. Between 1974 and 1991, Rader murdered 10 people in and around Wichita. His victims range from children as young as 9 to adults in their 60s. He was organized, methodical, and controlled. He stalked victims for weeks before striking, what he called projects in his own journals. He left almost no physical evidence. He planned entrances and exits. He knew how investigators thought. And he communicated with them constantly. Letters, poems, crude drawings, cryptic packages. He wanted credit. He wanted fear. He wanted to be understood as someone extraordinary. For 17 years, he got away with it. And then in January 1991, after the murder of 62-year-old Dolores Davis, he went completely silent. The Otero family murders announced who BTK was with brutal clarity. On that January morning in 1974, Rader entered the home and killed all 4 family members present: Joseph, Julie, 9-year-old Joey, and 11-year-old Josephine. The method was deliberate, controlled, and premeditated. Rader had cut the phone lines before entering. He had planned every detail. 10 days later, a letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle newspaper, directing police to a note concealed inside a public library book. In that note, Rader described the murders in clinical detail only the killer could know, and signed it with 3 letters, BTK. Investigators now had a name. They still had no face. The killings continued. Catherine Bright, 21, Shirley Vian, 24, Nancy Fox, 25, Maureen Hedge, 53, Vicky Wedrell, 28, Dolores Davis, 62. Each murder carried the same signature. Each time, Rader vanished back into his ordinary life. And each time he communicated afterward, a letter, a poem, a phone call. In 1978, he called the Wichita Police Department directly from a payphone, cool and composed, to report a murder and suggest they contact the Homicide Division. The call lasted under a minute. He hung up and walked away. The communications weren't just taunts. They were, for Rader, a relationship. He saw himself as engaged in a contest with investigators, one he was winning. One he intended to win forever. Then 1991 arrived. Dolores Davis and silence. No more letters, no more calls. The case went cold. Investigators never closed it. They couldn't. But without new leads, without new communications, there was nothing to pursue. BTK had simply stopped. For 13 years, Wichita lived with the unresolved knowledge that BTK was still out there. The investigation never officially ended, but leads had dried up entirely. Forensic technology had advanced: DNA analysis, digital evidence processing, improved behavioral profiling, but without a new contact, there was nothing to test it against. Then in 2004, a local newspaper published a retrospective marking the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders. Something stirred. A letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle, then another, then a package. Over the following months, BTK sent more than a dozen communications to television stations, to police, to news outlets. He was furious. A book had been written about the case without his cooperation. A television movie hadn't properly depicted his crimes. He felt after 13 years that the world was moving on without him, that his work was being misrepresented. Investigators had tools in 2004 that didn't exist in 1974. But Rader had been careful for 3 decades. What would break him wasn't blood or fingerprints or eyewitness testimony. It would be a question he asked himself. In early 2005, Rader sent a communication to KSAS-TV, a local Fox affiliate in Wichita. He asked, through coded language, whether a floppy disk could be forensically traced if he used it to send a message. Investigators and the station publicly responded, no, floppy disks couldn't be traced. That was a deliberate lie. On February 16, 2005, a purple floppy disk arrived at KSAS-TV. Investigators immediately ran forensic analysis on the disk's metadata. Inside was a deleted Microsoft Word document. The document's properties showed it had been last edited at a location identified as Christ Lutheran Church. The user who last modified the document was listed as Dennis. A search connecting Dennis to Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita took approximately 90 seconds. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Lynn Rader was stopped in a routine traffic pullover. Investigators had confirmed his identity through DNA from his daughter's medical records. He was arrested without incident. 31 years, 90 seconds. To understand why Dennis Rader returned after 13 years of silence, you have to understand what he fundamentally was, not just as a criminal, but as a psychological type. Criminologists classify violent offenders along a spectrum from disorganized to highly organized. Rader sat at the extreme organized end. He planned meticulously, maintained a completely normal public identity for decades, and demonstrated extraordinary impulse control in his daily life. That kind of organization is rare and dangerous, but highly organized killers with narcissistic traits carry a specific and self-destructive compulsion. They need to be witnessed. The FBI's behavioral analysis of BTK describes what's often called a power reassurance orientation, a killer who commits crimes to experience control, but whose sense of control is never stable unless it's acknowledged externally. Rader didn't kill and go silent out of contentment. He communicated because the act alone wasn't enough. He needed the world to see it. 13 years of silence wasn't peace. It was pressure accumulating. When the anniversary article appeared in 2004, without his active involvement, without proper recognition of his crimes, Rader's ego couldn't absorb it. He felt erased. An erased narcissist is a volatile one. His returning communications showed someone who had rehearsed his own mythology for over a decade. He referred to himself in third person. He categorized his victims with clinical detachment. He issued clues to investigators not because he wanted to be caught, but because he wanted to be chased. He wanted a worthy adversary who would recognize his intelligence. The fatal mistake with the floppy disk wasn't carelessness. It was certainty. Rader was confident that he was smarter than modern forensics because he had been smarter than 1970s and 1980s forensics. He asked whether the disk could be traced, and when they said no, he believed them. He believed them because believing otherwise would have meant accepting he was fallible. And Dennis Rader had spent 31 years building an internal narrative in which he was not. Narcissism doesn't just make killers dangerous. It makes them predictable to anyone patient enough to wait. Dennis Rader was arraigned on 10 counts of first-degree murder. What followed in that Wichita courtroom is still studied in criminology programs today, not because of what was revealed, but because of how Rader revealed it. On August 18, 2005, he stood before the court and confessed. Not with remorse, not with collapse. He did it methodically, describing each murder in the same clinical, detached language he had used in his letters for decades. He referred to his victims as projects. He mispronounced the name of a woman he had murdered and whose family sat feet away. Survivors and victims' families sat in that room and listened. Kansas had no death penalty at the time of Rader's crimes. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences, the maximum the law allowed. He remains incarcerated at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. He has continued giving interviews from prison. The detachment has never wavered. Carrie Rawson, the daughter of Dolores Davis, Rader's final victim, has spent years publicly documenting the devastation his crimes inflicted on surviving families. Not just the murders themselves, but the decades of not knowing. The years of watching her father interact with law enforcement investigators while standing over her mother's grave. The rupture that never fully heals. The BTK case is cited in FBI training modules on cold case re-engagement. It's used in behavioral science courses on narcissistic personality profiles in violent offenders. It's referenced whenever investigators study the psychology of dormant killers, specifically the conditions under which ego overrides discipline. And at the center of every analysis is the same conclusion. Dennis Rader wasn't caught despite his intelligence. He was caught because of it. 31 years of calculated evasion, dismantled in 90 seconds by a deleted file on a purple floppy disk, because a man who believed he was extraordinary couldn't resist asking if anyone was smart enough to find him. 10 families waited 31 years for that question. If this case stayed with you, it should. The BTK investigation is one of the most studied cold cases in forensic history, and behavioral scientists are still drawing conclusions from it today. Cases like this one are exactly what CrimeDossier exists for. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, cases that will challenge everything you think you know about how killers operate, how investigations work, and what justice actually looks like. Hit subscribe. Stay with us. Here's what's hardest to let go of about Dennis Rader. He was a compliance officer. He enforced city ordinances. He issued violations for dogs off leashes, for parking infractions, for grass that grew too tall. His neighbors complained he was too strict, too rigid, too zealous about making others follow the rules. A man defined by control, by order, by his authority over other people's choices. That man killed 10 people, and for 31 years he sat at family dinners, attended church services, drove his children to school, and no one knew. After a case like this, the question that follows you isn't how Dennis Rader was finally caught. It's how many years he wasn't. SEOTAGS. True crime, cold case. BTK killer, Dennis Rader serial killer, criminal psychology, forensic investigation, BTK documentary, unsolved crimes, narcissistic killer, criminal profiling, FBI behavioral analysis, Wichita murders, true crime documentary, BTK cold case description. The BTK killer terrorized Wichita, Kansas for 17 years, murdering 10 people between 1974 and 1991. Then he vanished. For 13 years, investigators waited. Then a newspaper anniversary article reawakened something dangerous. Dennis Rader, known only by his self-given initials, couldn't stand being forgotten. He began communicating again. And one decision involving a purple floppy disk gave investigators everything they needed. This is the story of how BTK's arrogance ended a 31-year cold case, and what his psychology reveals about narcissistic killers who need to be seen. We examine the forensic turning points, the behavioral patterns FBI profilers use to this day, and what happened when Rader finally stood before a Wichita courtroom. Subscribe to CrimeDossier for weekly true crime investigations. BTK killer true crime cold case criminal psychology, forensic investigation, serial killer Dennis Rader CrimeDossier.